Welcome to the CTA podcast. Join us as we critically examine the ideological capture of the psychotherapy field. Here we discuss better, common humanity proposals for a fairer society. Our discussions are thought-provoking, and our guests are from diverse backgrounds, bringing unique perspectives to the table. This is the CTA podcast with your hosts, Jaco and Christine Siefen. Welcome everybody, welcome to the Critical Therapy Antidote with myself, Jaco co-host Christine Siefen, and our returning guest, Dr. Lucas Klein. Hello, Lucas.
Hi, happy to be here.
It is lovely to have you with us again. We would like to pick your brain again. I just have to say, Dr. Lucas Klein's podcast, Real Clear Podcast, is a must listen. After our first interview with you, I explored some more of your podcast episodes, Lucas, and I have to say, I devoured some of them. Well done. I love the discussion. I love the depth to it. I love the breadth that you add to it and the diversity of ideas and the diversity of guests you have on the podcast. Really well done. Keep it up. We would love to see some more quality information from you.
Thanks so much. That's nice to hear. And you guys are doing a fabulous job as well.
Thank you.
I second all of Jaco's sentiments, by the way.
So our discussion for today is the Holmes Commission on Racial Equality in American Psychoanalysis of 2023. It is a very controversial report that was recently released. And we appreciate the sensitivity of the matter, but we also appreciate the possible harm this matter can do if the issue of race and racism isn't well navigated. And my concern is that we're already at the threshold of a type of a schism that's about to take place within psychoanalysis. But let me not spill the beans now. How about we start with a general overview of the report, and as we proceed, we will highlight certain issues of it. It is only one episode we will be doing now. How about we see how deeply we can go into the report, and maybe this will develop into a series of discussions. So
that sounds great. Yeah. So let me start off with the executive summary and giving an introduction to the report, and then we'll go where we go. So the Holmes Commission on Racial Equality and American Psychoanalysis, named after one of the lead authors of the Holmes Report, was formed in August 2020. Reading from the executive summary, the impetus for its formation came from several years of mounting demand that the American psychoanalysis express itself on the importance of psychoanalytic understanding of race. That's news to me, by the way. I'm a psychoanalyst. I'm not aware of mounting pressure in the ranks of my community of obscure academics in psychoanalysis demanding that we have an entree into racial dynamics and race essentialism, which is essentially what this report is. The continuing racial atrocities occurring in the United States starting in 2020 became the immediate catalyst, and so on and so forth. I'm going to skip through a lot of this because, frankly, the entire report reads like a catechism. It is like a hymnal for a religious text. So I'll go through some excerpts, however, to give people an understanding of what this report is and what it's intended to be. We developed the practice of beginning each commission meeting with a roll call and inspirational music or text message. Okay, I'm somewhat of a scientist, and I know I'm not the only one on this call who is as well. I can't recall in my research during my doctoral process, as well as subsequent research that I've done, where I started off a research meeting with inspirational music or a text message. Or what they also admitted that they did, which was examine their own racism, personal stories about systemic racism at the beginning of each meeting as well. So we already have a sort of catechism that forms the tone of this report, and it trickles all throughout the over 180 pages. By the way, that is an enormous amount of pages for a research paper. If I went over 25 minutes during my dissertation defense, they would have failed me. You have to concisely condense what you find, but they can't. And so they're hiding amidst a lot of fluffy language as well as drawn out linguistic sleight of hand. But let me not digress too much further. The purpose of the commission was to appraise systemic racism in American psychoanalysis and, where found, to offer recommendations and a path forward to reduce its pernicious effect. So you'll notice there that it's not as though they're trying to measure whether or not there is racism present. It's just given, okay, that it is. And where it's found, it's going to be identified and solved. Okay, so going through the conceptualization of race used for the commission study. And I want everyone here to remember something very important. Anytime you're going to use conceptual design in a research project, you have to have something called content validity. All right, content validity means you have an idea that you're going to present in the social sciences, and you're going to try to formulate that into some sort of measurable, measurement. And in order to do that, you have to make sure that the very concepts you're using make sense. All right, so typically what you would have is, say you're using the term race or racism. Well, exactly how is that measured? You should have measurement items. You should have a series of questions. This study is using surveys. So you've got numerous surveys. By the way, they had so many survey items, they couldn't possibly have had the statistical power to analyze these sufficiently and produce a meaningful effect size. Not even possible. And by the way, I can't find anywhere in this report where they have given us the sample size, the specific measurements used, a methods section, none of it. This is complete dreck. So they don't even go through a proper methods section. I have no idea the sample size. They just admit somewhere in the paper that the sample size for so-called BIPOC analytic candidates was small. That's all we know, okay? And I suppose you could string together somewhere in their samples where they produce some amount of numbers per item. You could possibly establish an overall sample size, but that's not proper research. This should be listed very straightforwardly in a methods section, and it's not. Okay, so there's the backdrop. Let me go through the conceptualizations of race used for the commission study, and then I'll turn it over to the crew for us all to discuss. We considered race as a social construct invented and perpetuated to support systemic racism. Anyone ever heard of a circular definition? Okay. We recognized racialism. That's not a word, by the way. That's a made-up postmodern word. We recognized racialism as the exposure of all members of a society to ideas and narratives that influence individual thoughts and perceptions about members of racialized groups. Another circular definition. Okay, we defined racist acts as behaviors performed by individuals or small groups that reflect prejudice, discrimination, stereotyping, or antagonism directed against a person or people on the basis of their membership in a particular racial or ethnic group, particularly a minoritized or otherwise marginalized group. We acknowledged racial enactments as how ideas around race and racism unconsciously play out in group processes and interpersonal processes. Systemic racism was the main interest of the study, which we understood to be a system that produces advantages for some people in a dominant racial group through the oppression of people in a non-dominant racial group. Before I go on to the last thing that they used as a construct, I want everyone to realize just how postmodern and, frankly, equity-based that is. They're saying any difference between groups is the result of oppression, okay? Right. So that's the people would call that woke. Some people call that neo-Marxism. Call it what you'd like. The idea is any group differences that occur must not be naturally occurring or occurring through a means that we don't fully understand, but must be occurring, we're certainly sure of this, through oppression. Okay, they're starting off their paper on these premises. Last thing I'll say, they said these structural elements of racism are embedded in individual psyches and institutional practices and can be ubiquitous, operating outside of the conscious awareness of the individual or institution carrying or practicing systemic racism. So there's the catch. None of this is conscious, folks. We know it's inside of you. And throughout the paper, they make reference to people denying that this is present in them, which is surely evidence that it's present in them. Right. Okay. Lastly, they end up by making statements about Euro-white normativity and so on and so forth. And they went through a sort of painstaking section of describing how they were very hesitant to group all non-white people into one group called BIPOC, but they managed to get over it and do it, and so on and so forth. And that's the beginning of this very important paper.
Right. So let's take it piecemeal now. So one of the things that stood out to me was right in the beginning, the continuing racial atrocities occurring in the United States in 2020. Continuing racial atrocities. Do you know anything about racial atrocities? When I think of racial atrocities, I think of the Rohingya being slaughtered, or I think of the Uyghurs being systemically destroyed in China, or I think of the genocide in Rwanda. Those would be racial atrocities.
Yeah. They're talking about what happened later on in the report, and as you know, Lucas, because you've, I'm sure, read this very deeply also, is they're talking about the summer of 2020. They're talking about the beginning of the movement after George Floyd's death, what launched this huge movement, and the summer riots, which were riots here in the United States, where cities were set on fire. They're talking about those being the atrocities. That's the entire kind of foundation upon which a lot of this was written, is because of the riots that happened after George Floyd died in 2020. So that's how I'm going to answer that question. Those are the atrocities. Which wasn't against an entire group necessarily anyway, but I'm going to leave it there.
Yeah. Could it perhaps be this idea around police brutality?
Police brutality, sure, that's the BLM movement, right? The Black Lives Matter movement is about police brutality, and Black Lives Matter is specifically related to Blacks stating that they are harmed by police or they're arrested by police more often than any other racial group that exists. So even if you even the statement you made earlier, Lucas, that they say they were hesitant to throw BIPOC altogether. Well, absolutely, because I guess I'm part of the BIPOC group, and I have absolutely nothing to do with or in common with any of the supposed assumptions of the BIPOC group. So that is absolutely not a given, and they themselves admit that. So right there's a bit of credibility that's lost. And specifically, the Black Lives Matter movement was about police brutality with Blacks being at a higher percentage than any other racial group. That's what that's about.
Isn't,
yeah,
but
go ahead.
That has been disproved, right?
It's been disproven, but there's no study. I mean, that's not what's popularized, is the disproven study that they did among the NYPD, also among implicit bias and among police brutality. And that was somehow swept under the rug. That was covered up.
You guys are talking about evidence, by the way. Don't you know that certain racial groups have other ways of knowing?
Yes.
Aren't you aware of this? There's
that is the one point.
Discrimination.
Right. That is true. And for them to make such a bold statement around atrocities, and for them to repeatedly refer to the death of George Floyd as a wake-up call or a call to action, just shows you that they didn't consider any other possible explanation for what is going on systemically in America. And there have been research done in the racial bias in police shootings and police killings. And the Harvard professor, Professor Roland Fryer, is a Black professor, and he debunked this idea of bias, anti-Black bias in police shootings.
That study was published in Psychology Today, by the way. the debunking implicit bias. And the reason that I
Right.
say that and why that's so powerful is because psychology today tends to lean very, very left, tends to align with the more progressive radical views, but they even had the courage, I'm going to use that word in this current state that we're in, the courage to actually publish that study that debunked implicit bias among NYPD police officers. So I just want to give it that little bit of extra credibility that that's actually out there and something that you are able to find.
Right. Lucas, you wanted to say?
Yes, I think it's important, the basis that you're both establishing here, which is the fact is that there is no evidence that the claims of BLM, which led to the destruction of major American cities and the dystopian nightmare that is, say, the entire West Coast right now in any urban area. There is no evidence that the claims made by BLM are accurate on any grounds. As you mentioned, Roland Fryer, he found that there's a 20% increased likelihood that police will go hands-on with a Black suspect in custody, but that there is actually a less likelihood that they're going to be shot on the basis of their skin color. In fact, you found there's a slightly increased risk of being shot if you're white. Okay, well, none of that matters, okay? If you look at this report, nobody's establishing any ground of actuarial risk. Nobody is pointing out numerical realities. Everything is subjective now. And so you wonder what the atrocities are. The atrocities, and these people who authored this report and people like them, honestly and truly, I think, believe that atrocities can be measured by psychological harm, by emotional discomfort, by a feeling of alienation from microaggressions, which is one of their measurement tools, by the way. As you go through this report, folks, if you're listening and you're not a psychoanalyst, just trust me, this is important. They're going after the people who program other people in society. You could look at the entire mental health field as a catchment for, well, we are programmers of other people's minds. You could look at it that way. And they're trying to program the programmers to instill this kind of anti-racist, neo-Marxist code in the programmers. And that's why this is so important. One of the new programs that's running through America and through Western civilization is harm is not just harm. You started off talking about cleansing of certain tribes and ethnic groups, you know, actual violence as we've historically known it to be. No. The new program is there is emotional violence. If someone feels harmed, that's an atrocity. And don't you know? So if you deny that, then you're coming from any number of the patriarchal, choose your archy, you know, patriarchy and so forth, right? And you're just dismissed because of that. And this paper goes through and claims that American psychoanalysis is racist and is a form of white supremacy. All right. They don't even adequately define that term again. And this toward a group of people who have been bending over backwards for decades to get any Black candidate they can into the field. I know this. I know this to be the case that is. I'm a psychoanalyst. I've been on the committees of institutes before. They are bending over backwards to get Black candidates in the field. And the reality is that they do not want to acknowledge is they don't have enough candidates lining up. They don't have enough candidates, period. We don't have enough candidates of any race. And we certainly don't have enough candidates who are Black. They simply do not exist. They're not lining up at the door, knocking on and saying, let me in. And some sort of stodgy, antiquated white training analyst at the upper ranks of these institutes is simply saying, no, I won't let you in because you're Black. This is a total myth and fantasy. It's not in touch with reality in any way. And they're claiming that it is.
That's what I get into in my chapter and what we were talking about earlier a little bit, Jaco. So I won't jump the gun, but we're going to put a pin in that because we're going to return to that when we get to chapter 2 about education and why we don't have a variety of BIPOCs in the field. Go ahead, Jaco.
So we see a clear commitment to a certain doctrine. We see a clear bias, a tendency, a central tendency to interpret evidence in just one specific way. They do not consider alternative explanation or positive explanations to the information that they were gathering. Another point I would like to look into is this this idea around race, and just listen to what they're saying. We considered race as a social construct invented and perpetuated to support systemic racism. For people who give such a negative definition about race, they are very obsessed about it, and they love playing the race card. I would imagine for people giving such a bad definition, having such a bad sentiment about race, to want to repudiate it at all cost. These researchers have fully endorsed the idea of race, no matter how socially constructed it is, no matter how much it is invented to perpetuate and support systemic racism. They're in love with race.
I love the way you put that, if I might respond. Jaco, that's so well put. I think the reason that they are operating the way you describe, you just have to look at their outcome and recommendations to understand their motives. They are a form of radical postmodernism. And what I mean by that is they view all of the happenings in any society as being the outcome of the tyranny of power. And so obviously you're noticing something that is certainly true amongst this group. They are power hungry, and hence they're race hungry, because race is now aligns to power. And so they have to describe race in dismal, terrible, evil terms in order to accomplish what they would like, what they state in this report, which is they want an institution that monitors all of American psychoanalysis, a race equity institution. Just who do you think is going to run that? I'm betting that some of the authors of this report would want to. I'm betting that a lot of people who are power hungry would love to occupy those offices. By the way, that's the exact same prescription that Ibram Kendi has for America, which is an anti-racist institution that monitors and evaluates all other forms of government. Can you imagine a more platonic sense of narcissism?
Yeah. Then racial enactments. That is such an, it is, you know, this is the vaguest definition of racial enactments, as how ideas around race and racism unconsciously play out in group processes and interpersonal processes. Group processes and interpersonal processes. You only need to read papers on racial enactments to know exactly what it's all about. Racial enactments are just pseudo-psychoanalytic. It's just a pseudo-psychoanalytic terminology for microaggression. You know, let me use myself as an example. When someone asks me, as soon as they hear me speak, and they ask me, where are you from? That would be considered a racial enactment if I were Black. But I'm not, so I couldn't consider that as a racial enactment. So I would say I'm South African. And they would notice that I wear a wedding ring. And they would ask me, oh, and you're married. Is your wife also interested in rugby? So that person assumes that I'm married to a woman. They also assume that I am interested in rugby. I'm somewhat interested in rugby, and I'm following the World Cup. Absolutely, this Saturday is going to be an interesting game between Ireland and South Africa. But I'm not married to a woman. You see, if this was an issue to me, if I cathected a victim status as a gay man, and I cathected a victim status as someone who's ideologically possessed and puritanical, I would throw my toys out of my pocket. But I'm not, because I understand what that other person is doing. They're trying to accommodate me. They're looking for common ground. Apart from explicitly asking me about my background so that they could accommodate me, they might jump to conclusions from what they could derive from what I already
Jaco.
But is that is labeled as aggressive, right?
That is an indication. That is an indication of kindness, of social
Yes,
kindness, of
versus
well-adapted social
aggression.
kindness.
Yes,
Versus aggression.
Mhm.
versus
But
aggression.
according to these ideologues, this would be racial enactment.
Yes.
And that
As
is
somebody
racist, by the
asking
way.
me, and I can say because I'm BIPOC, which I don't identify as BIPOC, by the way, so I say that with the utmost sarcasm. When people ask me, where am I from? Are they talking about where am I from in California? When they meet me here where I live in California, what part? Or are they talking about what my racial background is? Are they talking about where my parents came from? It could be a million things. And so I simply ask, do you mean, am I from California? Or are you asking me about my ethnic background? And for me, okay, I am honored to share about my ethnic background. I am honored to share about living in Northern California. And quite frankly, I find it so much friendlier and so much more of a warm conversation than for somebody to assume, right, based on the color of my skin, that I must have a certain kind of experience, or that if they ask me questions about my experience, that they're in some way harming me. I'd rather you ask me the question to try to get to know me, to try to build a rapport, than to make an assumption that I have been oppressed in any way, because I have not been in any way, shape, or form, neither as a woman, nor as a woman whose parents are immigrants, nor as a woman who's from the Middle East on top of it all. That's a friendly, that's not an aggressive comment to make.
That's
right?
very
But
well
that's
put.
what we've changed it into. Go ahead.
Well, it's very well put, although I think that you're probably not aware of your white adjacency, Christine.
Yes, well, that would be.
Look at you.
Yes.
You're up on the screen next to two white men. I mean, this is really
white adjacent. Yes.
Yeah. By the way,
Yes.
there are people who would believe truly what I just said. That's how disturbed of a society we're in. I want
Yes,
to return to Jaco's eloquent statement. Jaco, I have to commend you because you're taking such a thoughtful, I won't say subdued, but I understand your tact. You're being very Socratic about this and rather conserved in your approach. So I commend you there. I must notice that what you just described with respect to wondering about how someone is inquiring about you with racial microaggressions and so forth that certain people might assume are present. You're describing the principle of mentalization in psychoanalysis, which is the capacity to keep in mind that other people have discrete internal thoughts, feelings, fantasies, cognitive processes, backgrounds, and so forth, and that you might want to suspend your foreclosure on understanding their behaviors as coming from any particular cause. That's mentalization. Yeah. It is a hallmark of mature psychological functioning, and it's found, its paucity is found in borderline functioning. So, Jaco, are you saying that the race-obsessed people amongst our ranks are borderline organized?
No, I would much rather say that they are narcissistically organized. Because in narcissism, there is also this projective acting out, the projective enactments of assumptions about what the other person is thinking. And I'm taking it from a Mastersonian perspective. All disorders of the self have this tendency to give priority to own projections, as opposed to sustaining them and considering the possibility of an external reality that might not align with my internal world.
Maybe this is a cluster B situation rather than
a cluster B situation.
Yes, right.
Well, right.
Maybe to an extent.
Chris Rufo did so well in his segment on cluster B in society. I'm envious. It's causing me an urge to destroy. You know, Rufo, come on.
All right. That's why I had to throw it in there.
Good, yeah.
And then ultimately, their bias on page 10 when they say the commission adopted the convention of using uppercase for African American and Black and lowercase for white. I mean, they have to demonstrate.
I feel harmed.
They have to demonstrate their virtue in acknowledging the constant suffering. So they need to show the white person.
Is that the only one that's capitalized? What about Mexican? Is Mexican capitalized?
Well,
what about Egyptian?
Egyptian is nowhere near capitalization, no. Christine. No,
Egyptian
that's not yet.
Even considered a minority, according to I think it was Obama's administration. They ripped the Middle East out of the minority group and said, "There's not enough of you to make up a minority that's been harmed." So we got kicked out, into the Caucasian group, by the way. Just a little side note there on that. But yes, I don't get any capital letters.
No, you're sidelined. One of the most absurd aspects of this entire report can be found in the actual items themselves. So they make these grand conclusions that psychoanalysis is systemically racist, is in fact even white supremacist in many ways. And they end up by saying we have to act now before it's too late. They have this hysterical conclusion that we have to act now. And if you look at what they are measuring the terrible circumstance through, you look at the items, the measurement items, they're nothing but a survey of people's feelings. The entire thing is just a survey of people's feelings. Did you feel as though the institution you trained in was sensitive to racial issues, for instance? And if a certain amount of people said no, it's like, oh, look at that. They said that there isn't enough sensitivity. That's probably an indication of racial problems. It's like, excuse me, since when is somebody's subjective impression of the world representative of veridical external reality? That's another way of defining narcissism, eh?
Right. So before I actually went in depth into these chapters, and I just read the executive summary and the introduction, my first thought was, how could a report like this in any way come from a psychoanalytic body, or a body that claimed to be psychoanalytic? I mean, think about this. They're using using perception as a determining factor to indicate reality. I mean, the whole purpose of psychoanalysis is to analyze your projections, to see how external reality registers with you, to map out your internal world so as to decouple those two and to gain greater appreciation of the external reality, as opposed to participating in projective acting out.
So well put, Jaco. So well put. It boggles the mind. I want to ask the two of you a question. I really can't determine if the mental health field as we know it is just completely destroyed at this point versus whether these radicals are just taking the limelight. I hope the latter is true, but Jaco, what you just said is so stunningly ironic and paradoxical. It just, we can't be the only people in the world of psychoanalysis talking about this, but I guarantee we're the only people being vocal and outright about it.
I don't know how many therapists, psychoanalysts, mental health professionals out there are really awake, and I don't know how many more are doing more harm. But my issue isn't so much with them doing nothing. My issue is with them doing more harm. That's what I'm seeing, and that to me is the biggest problem. The do no harm oath that we're all supposed to take. Where are these mental health professionals at with all of this? I'm not seeing it look very good in many different contexts.
My appreciation of the situation is that I've found psychologists and mental health professionals to be rather compliant and obedient. You know?
Yeah, right.
Well, that's what it is.
The point remains that truth is partisan. There's no such thing, think about that. There's no such thing as neutrality.
That's true.
You can commit to wanting to be as objective as possible, as neutral as possible. But when you're dealing, or when you're sitting with someone in front of you, and you can see that their lifestyle is causing themselves a lot of harm, and for the sake of maintaining neutrality, you keep quiet about that. You're not being neutral. You're disavowing reality, because reality and truth tends to be partisan.
Right. There's a value-driven aspect to both reality and truth. And Christine, I think where you went with your description of hope versus dystopian outlooks for the mental health field is the same wine in a different bottle as with the racial hysteria. And it is essentially, and ties into what Jaco is saying here, this is essentially, we're not going to in any way remain analyzing good enough objective analysts against infantile aggression and libido. We're going to gratify. That's what we're doing now as a
That's
culture
right.
of gratification. And we
That's
used, you know,
right.
the whole field of analysis was based around optimal frustration. All right. And in other words, helping people gain a sense of how they're unconsciously and defensively gratifying infantile wishes and so forth, and
Right.
get along in a more mature manner in life where they can have more fulfilling relationships and occupational embeddedness in humanity. And
Right.
that's really the prospect and proposition of psychoanalysis. And we seem to have shifted with respect to sex, gender, and race into pure gratification. And what
Yes.
that is looking like is you have a feeling and you're non-white, that feeling is completely unquestionable.
Yes.
That feeling is representative of everything happening to you externally without a doubt. And who am I to even think that I would question the way you're seeing things? That's where we are now as a field. And there was a bit of pushback against this report and against this sort of radical race essentialism that is brewing in American psychoanalysis, which I think is already overtaken the rest of the mental health field, but is just now roving into American psychoanalysis. APSA held a Zoom meeting, which you can find on YouTube about a month ago or more, where all of the senior analysts from around the country got together and addressed this issue of these social justice, psychoanalytic bent people coming into and trying to radically overturn the field. I must say, I was glad that they were finally talking about it, but in watching it, I realized if these are the people speaking up on behalf of traditional psychoanalysis, there's no chance we're surviving as a field. They were completely muted, obscure, overly deferential. Everything they said got lost in qualification. These are not fighters. They're not prepared to take up this battle because they think that they can engage with the other side, the race essentialists and the radical postmodernists, on the grounds of muted rationality. And that assumption involves psychic equivalence, where they believe that the other side is coming from a rational basis. They're not. They're coming from a completely unmetabolized, aggressive basis. They will chew you up and spit you out without so much as a buy or leave for your welfare. If they think you're standing in their way, they will go to any length, it seems to me, based on observing their antics, to make sure that you heal to the demands of their new script for what's good for society. So you have to be, I think what you said is so important, that truth is partisan. If you have a sense as to what is really represented in reality and you want to fight for it, you have to fight right out front. You can't fight in a muted way. You can't be scared, and you can't try to opine to the pseudo-intellectual framework within which they couch their ideology.
Right.
That's the other issue, though, is speaking out, right? Because where is speaking out going to lead us necessarily?
Right.
To be canceled, to be fired, to be disciplined by your board. I mean,
I don't care anymore.
This is long. Yeah.
I cannot live in this world where this kind of nonsense and frankly lunacy is percolating through my field.
It's insanity. Absolutely. Jaco, go ahead. Sorry to cut you off.
No, absolutely. So in terms of the analytical frame, we know the importance of the paternal function. And that is essentially what leads to individuation and to maturity. Psychological health is a neurotic structure where you, to some extent, collude and participate with the paternal function. In other words, we leave the coziness of the maternal function, we internalize that sufficiently so as to master external reality with the promise of gaining unity with mother again. That is the great Oedipal myth that we take along with us throughout our lifespan. What happens when we disavow the paternal function? In Lacanian psychoanalysis, and next time we should actually just elaborate and maybe discuss this in greater detail, I have found the wokest of all psychoanalysts are the Lacanians. Now, but even from a Lacanian perspective, the disavowal of the symbolic, the disavowal of the paternal function creates one of the three psychic structures in Lacanianism. On the one hand, you have neuroticism. On the other hand, you have the psychotic structure. In the other scheme of psychoanalysis, we have the borderline structures. in terms of the dimensional scales. But in Lacanian psychoanalysis, the third one is perversion. So what they're doing is they converted the psychoanalytic frame, psychoanalytic space, from a neurotic or a neuroticizing space to a perverting space. And this is toxifying from a Winnicottian, Klein, and Jungian perspective. Like you said, to some extent, we are programmers of people's mind. We cannot just assume that if someone sits in front of us and we interact with them, that there is a natural progression to health. That is not necessarily the case. We invest in the other person too. And if we have a toxifying tendency, we will toxify the other person. And if the frame is restructured to be a perverting frame, we will be colluding with the patient and turn them into people who have perverse tendencies of disavowing reality.
Very well put, Christine. I'm wondering what your take is on that, what might seem like an obscure, esoteric, psychoanalytic description. I'm wondering how your reaction might help us distill all that.
Well, it's
very well put.
interesting because we were talking about, and I'm just going to go back to the paternal function and the maternal function. We were talking about this last time with one of our guests on the show. That episode will be up soon, and about how the destruction of the paternal function has massive consequence. So essentially, if I'm going to break this down into terms that, I'm not a psychoanalyst, folks. Everybody out there, I'm not as brilliant as these two geniuses here in front of me, but what I can do is talk a little bit about how that sort of relates. So the maternal function is the piece of us, or the nurturing that has been keeping us in a bubble, right? Everybody gets first prize. Everybody gets first place. We're going to love everybody until they love themselves. We are going to acquiesce to everybody's want, desire, urges, everything that's out there, so that people are happy. That's what we want. I mean, to the avoidance of any kind of rule, any kind of structure, anything that's reality based, which would be attributed to the paternal function. So the piece of us that needs boundaries, the parts of us that need reality testing, that need to have some sort of foundation in law and order and the rule of science and the rule of keeping a society intact. Those would be considered the paternal functions, which are being eradicated, right? So everybody's getting attended to based on their drives, their needs, their internal wants. So you can have it
pleasure
all
principle.
now. You're the pleasure principle to the complete, destruction and diminishing of science altogether by choosing your own gender, for example, rather than dealing with the harsh realities that life is painful, the harsh realities that sometimes we have to do what we don't want to do. That's a measure of being grown up, to the reality that at some point you make moral decisions based upon what's right, or what you consider to be right or wrong, not just based upon the avoidance of getting in trouble, as children do, for example. All of those growth pieces of us, the part that doesn't want to adult, we don't want to adult, we don't want to be grown up, we don't want to have those responsibilities. That's the paternal function that's being completely washed away or whitewashed or in some way dismissed, which is why we have anarchy and chaos, because everybody's running around getting these desires filled, and everybody's right, and everybody's going to get their first place trophy prize, and everybody's going to get to be pansexual, non-binary, whatever sexual they want. There's no such thing as rules. We're all going to be androgynous one day. You pick and choose what you are. You can even choose to be a cat, like some of our younger 12 and 13-year-olds are choosing to do, without a balancing rule and order component or function that keeps us placed into a solid foundation, which is what we need as human beings, especially children. So that's how I would make sense of this, hopefully in words and language that seems to be more relatable to our
so well put. It takes a non-psychoanalyst to make sense. You know what I mean?
That was great.
Just being
I wouldn't
nice.
have said it any better myself.
Yes, right. The
Yeah.
urges and the nurturing that we all want.
No,
The
absolutely.
fundamental issue, the undergirding first factor of craziness that we're all putting our finger on is ultra subjectivity holding sway. It is it's a deviation away from Aristotle. It's a deviation away from evidence. I mean, this is the peril of pure rationalism. That's why I referred to Platonic narcissism earlier on in the meeting, because Plato was a profound narcissist. As anyone who has read the Republic realizes, he thought that there needed to be these philosopher kings that ruled over the rest of society because they were so smart. And that's right. They would be coiffed intellectually to reign supreme over the idiots. And that's what we're seeing now, is a sort of Platonic narcissism percolating through this anti-racism literature. They simply know the right way of being. They know the truth, and they don't even need to look at evidence. That's what we're seeing here. So they just created this doctrinal list of findings, which conveniently have no real measurement to them because they're always intended to produce the outcome that they already know is true. This is Platonic narcissism. And it's found all throughout the report. And what do we do in a society where people no longer believe that you must look at evidence in the world to confirm or deny your own suspicions and predilections? That's another aim of psychoanalysis, which is so ironic that we're allowing this kind of nonsense to percolate in our field. One of the other aims of analyzing transference and neurotic defenses and analysis is to help people gain a more accurate picture of what's really true and what's really likely in their world, in their experience, right? So you have someone come in and they're terrified. Say you've got a young attorney who comes in and has a neurotic history, is terribly anxious and has all kinds of projections and fears and internal fantasies about what's going to transpire when he goes to trial, and has all kinds of distortions that cause enormous suffering on his end. Well, you would want to help that person realize where there are projections of sadism, where there are projections of paranoid ideology and so forth, and outlandish fears that are very unlikely to exist in external reality, so that that person can have a smoother work life and suffer less under the belief that his internal experiences beautifully map onto, in an accurate way, what is going to happen in the world to him. In other words, this is what analysis is meant to help people with. And yet, with respect to race and gender and all the rest, we seem to all of a sudden say, no more analysis on these topics. If you have any kind of paranoia regarding racism or racial enactments or microaggressions, we're not going to analyze the internal world through which this forms. We're simply going to say to you in the most ingratiating and inauthentic way possible, yes, I'm sure you're seeing everything perfectly accurately, right? And that's what you see in this paper.
Yes.
They cite microaggressions as a cause for people dropping out of analytic programs.
Yes.
Oh my God, can you imagine? Where are you from? I got to drop out.
Yes, that's right.
I have to drop out.
Imagine that.
Yes, you asked me where I'm from.
I will
I
even tell you that a real life example is a couple of therapists that were working on their hours or trainees dropped out because the they were microaggressed by clients,
by their patients. Oh my God, Christine.
Okay, drop out. I'm conscious
gonna have a stroke.
Well, this is what I told Jaco. How could you not throw your computer out the window as you're reading this? I mean, that was
it was hard to read
what I messaged him. But
the kids,
I'm aware
the kids are running the show.
Yes, but I'm aware of the time, and we're trying to keep these at an hour or so.
Right.
And I think we've got so much more to cover. So I think this is turning into a series, is what I'm going to go ahead and say.
Absolutely.
And let's go ahead and do we want to end on a note right here and pick this up on our next episode?
So how about we create some expectation for our next episode? So for our next episode, we will see how far we get in covering chapter 1 and 2.
Yes.
But I think we set the stage. And I think it is clear for our listeners, I hope it is clear to our listeners, for them to realize that this is a small symptom in psychoanalysis that is, in fact, a reflection of a more systemic ailment. This is, in fact, the systemic symptom.
Yes.
What they're trying to prove through tail chasing and ghost busting is not the systemic symptom to systemic racism. This report is what it is. And maybe with our next section, I can frame our next episode by giving just a short outline of narcissistic large group regression. I know I am like a tune on repeat around narcissistic large group regression, but this is what we're seeing around us. I will give an outline of it. I will point out how even this report matches the steps of large group regression. And based on that understanding, we can then progress in analyzing the next 2 chapters and see how far we get. What do you think, Lucas?
That sounds fantastic.
Sounds great. And
right.
I think with that, we're going to call an end to this one. So thank you to
Thank you very much.
our listeners. Thank you to Lucas, especially for hanging with us as we move through this entire series. And hey,
well, I have to join because this is my only support group.
I love it. And my white adjacentness loves to be around
two
white men. Right.
Unbelievable.
You're the puppet in the hand
I love it.
ventriloquist.
That's right.
That's anyway.